How's it going, guys? Coach Weston here with Good Lift Performance. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about fatigue management, what that is, what are the variables that we need to be tracking, and how to use it in your own training. But before we get into today's video, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. And if you like the video, make sure to hit the like button. And if you could share this on your social media platforms, that would be great if you like the video. But without further ado, let's get into the video. All right, so let's talk about fatigue management. If you've ever read the scientific principles of strength training or just learning about programming, you'll know that fatigue management is one of the top three things that we're looking at when we're programming. Number one being specificity, number two being overload, and the third principle in priority is fatigue management. So fatigue management is just how do we manage the training. It's sort of the opposite of overload. Overload is how do we progress the training so we can make progress. Fatigue management is how do we manage the training so that we can allow the athlete to recover, manage the training so that we can reduce the risk of injury as much as we can, and keep the athlete healthy. So really, it's sort of the opposite. It's the pulling back. It's the making sure that we're recovering, making sure that things are all good to go so that we can proceed to then overload with our training. And so how do we go about measuring this in a systematic way so that we can make data-based decisions? I'm going to go over the four main metrics that you're going to use when using fatigue management so that you can keep track of your athletes, or if you're self-programmed, so that you can kind of auto-regulate yourself so that you can get the most out of your training. So the four main variables for fatigue management are external load, internal load, key performance indicators, and readiness. Those are the four main variables. And I'm going to go over what all those mean and then how you can track each of those. So the first one being external load. What does that mean? External load is literally just the work that we're doing. So it's very simply like the sets, the reps, the weight, like how much total work are we actually doing from a volume perspective, an intensity perspective. And so this is probably the simplest one to understand because this is honestly what most coaches do track. And so there's lots of different ways you can track this. You can track like just working sets, how many hard working sets you're doing. You can track number of lifts, which is sets times reps for an exercise. So you're tracking the total number of lifts per time, like total number of repetitions done per workout or per week. Or you can track tonnage being sets times reps times weight. So that will give you a number generally in the thousands range, and that will tell you the amount of literal weight moved. Those are the three main ones, either sets times reps, or sets times reps times weight. So you can add a layer to that depending on how you want to use that. When I think about measuring external load, I like to use tonnage. So the reason I like tonnage is because if you were to look on a graph, if you were to graph out your sets, your working sets, or your sets times reps, your number of lifts, or your tonnage, the first one, your sets, honestly is going to look like a pretty flat graph, right? It's generally you're going to be anywhere from 3, 4, maybe to 5 sets for most exercises. If you are for bench press, you might get up to like 6, 7, 8. You know, there's definitely some high set protocols, but it's going to be pretty static, and you're not going to see you're not going to see rises and falls. It's going to be pretty flat in terms of the graph. And so to me, whenever I look at that, it doesn't really tell me much, because especially with the way I program, I don't change the set count a ton. I keep that pretty static, and I mostly manipulate reps and intensity. So to me, I think about working sets very conceptually, but I don't use that as my primary way I track volume. Going on to number of lifts, a little bit better, but ultimately falls into the same trap of, all right, we can see how many total reps you're doing, but then what happens there is, let's say you're comparing two training cycles that are essentially the same, right? Let's say you ran a training cycle, 12 weeks, it worked really well, so you're going to rerun it again. So those graphs will look exactly the same. You won't actually see any progress, right? Because it's going to be the same number of lifts on week 1 of both training cycles. It's going to be the same for week 2 and week 3, so on and so forth. So you don't get to see any actual progress. There's more like up and down, so you're going to be able to see more contextually what's happening, but it also doesn't tell you too much when you're comparing training cycles, because you're just seeing the number of lifts. You're not seeing, like, it's going to look the same assuming you're running the same training cycle. That's why I like tonnage the most, because with tonnage, now we can see, all right, let's say we ran that same scenario, that we ran that same training cycle twice, but now we can see on the second cycle, you are stronger, you are lifting more weight, and so your tonnage is up. And so we can say, all right, you're doing the same protocol, but your tonnage is up. So we know we're progressively overloading. We know we're adding weight to the bar, and we're making progress. So that's why I like tonnage, because it allows us to it gives the most context of those metrics. Obviously, it doesn't tell us everything, right? It doesn't tell us, when we're just looking at the tonnage number, it doesn't tell us how many sets, how many reps, what was the RPE, right? But it does give us a more bird's eye view of, are we progressively overloading, which is primarily what I use a tonnage for, is, are we progressively overloading? And then when we're looking at, say, if an athlete is injured or something like that, we can look at how much tonnage they were doing and kind of get an idea, right, this is about where they were when they were making the best progress, here's where they're now at. Maybe we need to scale it back, or maybe we weren't doing enough and we were trying to push too hard in terms of intensity, but not doing enough volume, and whatever that might look like. So that's why I like tonnage the most in that scenario. And especially with how modern powerlifting training it ends up looking, I think tonnage definitely fell out of favor a while back, because people were arguing that you can't see a ton with that. But obviously we don't want to use that metric in isolation. But also now that training is becoming a lot more simplified and repeated, where we're not having these huge changes from block to block. It's primarily the same training ran over and over again with small tweaks. Tonnage becomes a lot more valuable, because we're comparing more apples to apples versus comparing apples to oranges. So that's why I like tonnage. And so when we're looking at how to manipulate tonnage, I think it's important that we understand that we don't make, for the most part, at least I don't make training decisions that to manipulate the tonnage, right? Looking at the tonnage is a byproduct, and it's a way to like double check your math in a sense. One thing that I am very particular about is that when I am trying to increase volume, let's say we're in a work capacity block and I'm trying to increase the sets or the volume that we're doing, I want to make sure that I'm not increasing it more than 1.5 within a 4-week period. That we're not multiplying the workload that we're doing by more than 1.5. There's studies out there to show that if you increase work too much too quickly, that's a big indicator for injury. And that number is usually 1.5 times work. So if you take your tonnage from week 1, compare it to week 4, and the week 4 tonnage is more than 1.5 times the week 1 tonnage, then that's a good sign you're probably doing too much. That's a good range of, when I'm looking at how I'm progressing lifters, I want to make sure I'm staying under that. And if, let's say, an athlete is coming back from an injury, and we're trying to get from point A to point C, all right, you're only squatting once a week, but we know we need to get you up to 3 times a week. We can more systematically build them back up to that range instead of going 0 to 100. So that's how I like to use tonnage in terms of manipulating it, so that we're double checking our math to make sure we're not doing too much too quickly in terms of progressing the athlete. So our first metric was external load, which is the literal load we were doing. Now we're going to look at the second one, internal load, which is inside. And so that's going to be looking at RPE. So RPE is how difficult was the work that we did, right? And so one of the biggest arguments against tonnage is that it doesn't give us the qualitative metric of what was the RPE on this stuff. So that's why we also add in internal load. How was the RPE? So now we're not only tracking how much total work we're doing, we're tracking how hard that work was. And so that's going to add a lot of clarity into that metric. And so when we're looking at RPE, we want to basically look at what was the average RPE for all sets done in a given week. And so that will give you a good indicator of how difficult the squat stress was for that week, the bench stress, and the deadlift stress. That's kind of what I look at. You can look at the average stress within a session. You can also look at the average stress within a week. And so when we're looking at optimizing for the structure of the microcycle or the week of training, that's more when I look at what is the average exertion of the day. when we're looking at fatigue management of making sure we're keeping the athlete healthy, that's where I look at the average RPE across the week for a given, for squat, bench, or deadlift. Those are the main categories I look at, because that's going to show me what was the average stress here. That way I can see where we're at there and kind of manage it from that perspective. So when we're averaging the RPE across the week for exercises, you're going to have to find the sweet spot for each lifter. It's going to be different. But I can tell you just from personal experience that since we're averaging it, the numbers are going to actually be on the lower end. So for the most part, if you have like a peak top set and lower back downs, you're going to be probably averaging around a 6 to a 7 RPE for the most part. And so if our RPE on average per week per exercise is around a 6 to 7, maybe for bench you can look more like a 7, 7.5, then we're probably in a good range there for internal load. When we start getting into an average RPE of 8 for the week or above, that's generally when hey, the average intensity here is too high. We need to deload, or we need to back off the intensity because the weights are just getting too hard. Because if you think about, let's say on squats, you're doing 10 sets a week and your average RPE is 8, that's going to be very, very fatiguing, and it's going to beat up the athlete a lot. So in my experience, anytime you're getting into an average RPE across the week of 8 or higher, that's a good sign that we need to deload or just drop the intensity, that things have probably just progressed, like we probably have gone too long without a deload, or things just progressed too quickly. We need to adjust things. Now, obviously, there might be spikes within that, with it, like let's say the athlete had a really stressful week of they got poor sleep, or they got into an argument with their significant other, or they were traveling. There's so many things that could affect that. If there's just a random spike in that, then you can take that with a grain of salt. Be like, all right, let's maintain. Let's try to repeat all the same week of training from this week to next week, and then let's see if the RPE drops or if it stays the same. Let's see how much of that external variables of traveling or whatever it was really played into the difficulty, or if it was just truly like an off week, right? So we don't need to immediately hit the panic button or hit the eject button when the RPE gets really high across the board, right? It might just be an off week, but it's definitely something to as a coach, you should be alerted. It's like, hey, why were the RPEs so high here if it was normally like a 6 to 7? Why was this an 8? Let's start having the conversation with the athlete, bring it up, hey, what kind of happened here? And that way we can start to manage that a little bit better. So that's how you would really use, or how I personally use, internal load. Next is going to be our key performance indicators. So this is more of a broad strength and conditioning term. Key performance indicator means what are our indicators inside of training that indicate a good performance. So in strength and conditioning, when we're looking, let's say for a field sport athlete, there are going to be certain tests that they do that will indicate how they're going to generally be able to perform on the field. Something like and I apologize, I'm a little out of touch with strength and conditioning, even though I'm wearing an NSCA shirt, funny enough. Something like your vertical jump test, or your maybe a sprint test, or 80% velocity, or something like that. There's different indicators that they will use to see, all right, how are the athletes made progress that will transfer over to the field. So for powerlifting, what does that look like? For powerlifting, we're really looking at estimated 1 rep max for our key performance indicators. Are our estimated 1 RMs going up? Now, remember, the caveat with estimated 1 rep max is that they're not they can sometimes not be the most accurate in terms of the precise number, right? But if we can see that the number is trending up, and we know that the RPEs are true, because generally we're going to gauge estimated 1 RM off of top set RPEs. And so if the top sets are trending up, we'll pretty much know that our our ability to perform on the platform in terms of our ceiling of what we could lift is going up, right? So we're tracking how much total work we're doing, how hard it is, and what is our estimated performance, right? So with estimated 1 RM, our key performance indicators, this is probably the most loose one that you're going to pay attention to. You want to see that it's trending up, right? But if it's not trending up, we have to make sure we understand why. So if you're in a volume block or hypertrophy block, or maybe you're in an overreaching block, we know that those can blunt top end performance. And so we might not see a big increase, or we might see just a little bit of increase, especially during a volume block. You might be doing so many reps in those blocks that you're not seeing these big increases. But then as you shift into a strength block, or maybe then you go to taper, then that's when that strength kind of pops back up. And so understanding why if it's not going up, why that's happening is really important. Now, if you are expecting, like you go into that strength block or that peaking block or that taper and your estimated 1RMs, your key performance indicators do not go up, that's a good sign of, hey, this didn't work the way we thought it was going to. Now let's make some adjustments. Or, hey, like if we see like it's a block where we think it's going to go up and it's actually just going down, then we know, hey, this training isn't working. We need to change direction. We need to change the stimulus, right? And so that's a good way of kind of seeing where's our estimated performance, what's happening with it. But we want to make sure we're taking a bird's eye view of that, making sure that we take that with a grain of salt and knowing that it's not the most clear or accurate representation, but it's a good, we want to look at the trends of where did this block generally go? And that's a better way to look at that. So yeah, that's key performance indicators. Last but not least, for our metrics we're going to track for fatigue management is readiness. So readiness is how ready does the athlete feel to take on the next session or the next week of training. How you track this is by doing a questionnaire, a wellness questionnaire. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. Personally, how I do it is I have a weekly check-in, and a lot of coaches will do a weekly check-in as well. It's very popular. And there's two parts to the weekly check-in. There is a handful of questions. Mine specifically has 6. And so it's 6 rate out of 1 out of 5. So they'll go over how is your recovery? How is your stress? How is your nutrition? How is your sleep? So on and so forth. And so there's 6 questions that you can rate on a scale of 5 is the most recovered, 1 is the least recovered. And then you rate those. That will give you a cumulative score of 30. Now, however many questions you do will change that number, right? But for me, mine's 6 questions, 5 possible points on each, so 30 total points. And then from there, I have a sort of red light, green light, yellow light system of if the score is within this range, we're green light, we're good to go. If the points are in this range, this more middle of the range, like, hey, like let's start, it's going to be a yellow light. All right, let's start to let's dive a little deeper. What's going on here? Is it time to potentially deload? Are we going to be deloading soon? Are we just at the end of the block and fatigue is high? That's fine. We can keep pushing. Or is it red? Is it really low? Like, hey, is there something going on outside of training that's really affecting you? Do we need to pull back? Do we need to change something? And so that's one way of managing that, is that's going to allow you to get the external variables of life. With all the other metrics that we've mentioned that life stress can affect those. And so this is a way of measuring life stress to the best of our ability. This is what's going to really round out our fatigue management system of measuring life stress to a degree. And so there's that questionnaire part. There's also, in my questionnaire, there's also an open-ended section of asking the athlete reflective questions of what went well, what didn't go well, is there anything going on? And so this allows them to not only just go 1 out of 5, but also open it up to discussion so that it prompts them to answer questions that allows me to go deeper into things that we need to be going over so that they can continue to optimize their training. And so that would be a weekly one. You can also do a daily one. And so there you're just going to have more data points. Either one of those works, and whatever works best for you as the coach to analyze that is going to be up to you. Personally, I like the weekly one. I think that asking an athlete to do a daily questionnaire, they'll start to skip it a lot of times and they won't do it. Versus if you ask them to do it once weekly, it allows them to kind of get an overview of the week. And usually they're doing it at the end of the week, so they're kind of able to kind of look back and reflect. And so there's also that positive quality of it. Gives them an opportunity to reflect on the week of training. So it just really depends on what works best in your system. Either one, daily or weekly questionnaire, works. It's a great tool for opening up lines of communication to talk to the athlete about what's going on. Because oftentimes if you just ask them, how you doing, how you feeling, they'll often just be like, oh, it's fine. And they'll forget to mention things. So when you prompt them to answer that question on a more regular basis, it encourages them to answer that question more open and honestly. And so that's the big one there of we need to also have that human component of, all right, I actually need to talk to my athlete. I need to know what is going on in their life. What are they going through? So that I can better manage their training, right? Because this is everything we mentioned before is all just training related, but we aren't athletes that live in this bubble where all we do is eat, sleep, train. They're going to have a job, or they have school, they have a social life. There's other things going on, and so we need to a degree, understand those and if they're going well or they're not going well and how they're going to affect training, right? We don't need to know every small detail of their personal life or work life, right? But we need to know big picture. Is something going on outside of the gym that's affecting you inside the gym, help use that information to manage the training. So in terms of how I use the readiness or the wellness questionnaire to adjust athletes' training, is I generally, going into each check-in that I do with an athlete, I have a good idea of where their wellness questions are going to be. Especially one of my questions is, how difficult was this week of training for you? And so I know if it's a deload week or an intro week, it's going to be on the lower end. If it's the middle of the block, it's going to be in the middle. And if it's the end of the block, it's going to be generally higher, right? So I have a good idea of where those things should be. And then but then when I get the check-in, if I see a number that's different than what I expect, then I can go, okay, what happened here? And we can start opening up that line of dialogue, or I can look at the training. And oftentimes we'll see if one metric is down in terms of one of those questions, other ones are down. So, and oftentimes, like in my questionnaire, the first question is, how difficult was that week of training for you? If that's a little bit lower, or if that is more difficult than expected, I'll look at how is their stress. A lot of times their stress is higher that week too, and I go, okay, and I'll scroll down and I'll see they've written out, so I had a rough week at work, or I had a rough personal week, and they'll give me some details, and I'm like, okay, yep, that makes sense, this all makes sense, perfect, we're adding context to what's happening. That's going to be able to really add context to all the other metrics that we've talked about earlier as well. Or maybe their nutrition and sleep are down, like, okay, it was the holidays, nutrition and sleep were down, that made training a little bit lackluster. All right, that's fine. Now we can go and say, all right, let's clean this up next week. Or if it's been, the other way you can use this is, if you see an athlete who, let's say, one of the questions is on my questionnaire is their excitement to train. Training excitement on a scale of 1 to 5. If they normally are putting like a 4 to 5, and then 1 week it drops down really low, I can go, all right, like, hey man, I saw you really just weren't into training this week. What happened? And so it allows me to just have more of those metrics to pay attention to what's happening. Like some athletes in that specific scenario, they might be like, oh yeah, just like it was a rough week, just wasn't feeling it. Or they might be like, hey, like I'm really just mentally burnt out. And so now that that's the first time I've seen like, hey, they've mentioned they're burnt out. All right, how can we start to address this? And so it allows you to catch those signs earlier on. So I think that readiness is probably of all the metrics you can track, readiness is probably the most important one, because that is the one where you are directly communicating to the athlete about how things are going outside of the gym, because those are some of the most important factors going into the gym, right? So if you're only going to use one of these, I'd almost strongly, you probably are best off going with readiness. You could manipulate the other ones without necessarily tracking those, but I would definitely track readiness. So like when my athletes finish their questionnaire, their answers get tracked onto a spreadsheet. I go and look at that before I do any of the check-ins, and I can kind of get a little sign, a preview of, all right, everyone's numbers are green. Oh, this one's yellow. All right, let's take a look. Like that kind of gives me a good sign of how we're all doing. Then I can also filter out and I can see the averages of, all right, how are they doing on average? Is there a big change from week to week? Or is it kind of consistent? And it also allows you to see if there's a sudden drop in, let's say, like enjoyment to train, or if sleep is been consistently down, we can start to address those things. So yeah, that's how I use readiness in my fatigue management system. So those are the 4 main metrics that you should be using during fatigue management. At least those are the ones that I use in my system. Some coaches might use some different ones. So if you track other metrics as a part of your fatigue management system, I would love to hear what you do. Make sure to drop a comment down below. And I'd love to hear what you guys do. If you made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. Make sure to hit that like button if you liked the video. And if you found this really informative, make sure to share this on your Instagram or your Facebook. That would really help out the video a lot. And make sure to subscribe for weekly powerlifting content. I took a week off over Christmas, New Year's, but I'm back with more informative content, and I'm also going to be working on some more behind the scenes vlog style content for you guys, because I know you've been wanting some of that. So look out for that. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys next time.